Welcome to Maricopa County Superior Court's Law Day 2020. I'm Judge Sarah Ogney. I'm one of the Associate Presiding Judges for the Maricopa County Juvenile Court. Our event this year will feature footage of the American Bar Association's traveling exhibit as currently stationed at our Arizona Supreme Court, an excellent PowerPoint showcasing materials from Arizona's State Library, archives, and public records, and most importantly, a fantastic panel and moderator that I will introduce to you in just a few moments. We are excited to partner with the ASU Women Law Students Association on this event as well. We are proceeding via Zoom this year and releasing this via social media platforms on May 1st, 2020, given the ongoing public health emergency. Wherever you are marking Law Day this year, we hope you and your family are healthy and safe. Before I introduce our panel and moderator, a bit of background on Law Day itself. Started by the American Bar Association in 1959 to promote respect for the rule of law, Law Day is celebrated on May 1st each year. That's by design. It was originally to counter May Day celebrations occurring in communist countries. The rule of law underpins our government in the United States, and central to that notion is that there are laws that we agree to follow as part of a social compact. Those laws are passed by our elected representatives, enforced by our executive branch, and interpreted by our courts. Each year, Law Day celebrations have different themes. The topic this year is Your Vote, Your Voice, Our Democracy, the 19th Amendment at 100. Without further ado, our panelists are Dr. Lois Brown, PhD. She is the ASU Foundation Professor of English and Director of ASU's Center for the Study of Race and Democracy. Dr. Brown's scholarship focuses include 19th century American literature, culture, and history. The Honorable Eileen Klein is the President Emerita of the Arizona State Board of Regents and was the 35th Treasurer for the state of Arizona. Her excellent opinion piece, Arizona Pioneered Suffrage, Here's Where Women Are 100 Years Later, was featured in the Arizona Republic on New Year's Day this year and is available on azcentral.com. Honorable Anne A. Scott Timmer was appointed to the Arizona Supreme Court in 2012 and currently serves as Vice Chief Justice. Prior to her appointment to the Arizona Supreme Court, Justice Timmer was a judge on the Arizona Court of Appeals from 2000 to 2012, serving 3 years as Chief Judge there. All of our panelists are moderated and assisted by Jessica Birch, a lecturer at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State University. Professor Birch's teaching interests revolve around civil litigation and federalism. Thank you to our panelists and moderator. I'm going to turn it over to Professor Birch.
Well, thank you, Judge Ogney, for that lovely introduction and giving us a little bit of background into Law Day. I'm really delighted to be here virtually with all of you. You're all such amazing, accomplished women, and I'm just humbled to be here to share our thoughts and experiences about women's suffrage, both here in Arizona and then nationally. I thought maybe it might make a little bit of sense for me to just set a tiny bit of the stage, and I assume many of you will have additional pieces of information and useful facts as we continue our discussion. But I mean, I'm sure as we all know, as a baseline, women haven't always had the right to vote, neither at local elections or state elections or at national elections. Arizona is really ahead of the curve on this. Arizona gave women the right to vote in 1912. At the first general election following statehood, Arizona voters, who were men, overwhelmingly voted in favor of an initiative to give women the right to vote. The federal government lagged behind a bit, so 8 years later, we get Congress passing the 19th Amendment. And then in August of 1920, we get the 3/4 of the states to ratify the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. And there's this really great story about that. Tennessee was the 36th state, so it was the 75th percentile mark for us to get the 19th Amendment. And it was sort of unclear which way Tennessee would go. And then one of the legislators got a letter from his mother, and he was urged to be a good boy and vote in favor. And so he was a good boy, he voted in favor, and of course now today we have the 19th Amendment and women have the right to vote. We have the right to vote in Arizona, we have the right to vote nationally, and of course in Arizona we also have direct democracy features. So we have the right to directly vote on laws initiated by public members. We have the right to vote on laws referred to the voters by the legislature. So I'm sure there's a lot more to be said, and actually I'd like to now, I think generally it's better to hear less from the moderator and more from our accomplished panelists. So I'd like to just start this off today by asking each panelist to reflect on her thoughts and experiences regarding the 19th Amendment at 100 years old and Arizona's corollary right, which is even older. It's a robust 108. And maybe make a few comments on why this anniversary is an important one for us to mark. I'd like to maybe start with Dr. Brown on this topic. So let me hand it over to you, Dr. Brown.
Well, thank you so much. And it's so good to be here, to be in such august company and to be thinking about such an important anniversary and political moment. I think in so many ways, the passage of the 19th Amendment and our commemoration at this 100-year mark really gives us a chance to understand and appreciate the power of civic engagement, right? That was a moment that truly authenticated women's place in the political public sphere. It also gives us a chance to think about the kinds of work that need to be done in order to secure what is imagined and believed to be an essential right for all American citizens. So once we begin to understand the kind of negotiations, the setbacks, the opposition, the strategies, the victories, and the unlikely partnerships and some of the less amicable arrangements that ensued, we get a sense of just how complex democracy is. But we also get an understanding of the real powerful perspectives that women bring to our sense of what America not only is, but can be. So this anniversary gives us a chance to recognize more of the story and many more of the stories that are part of the passage of the 19th Amendment, and also the pioneering role that Arizona plays in this larger conversation about democracy in America.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. President Klein, would you like to make a few comments?
You bet, thank you. This anniversary is really important to commemorate. It should be something that we celebrate every single year because it is a very precious right that we all possess. But in Arizona, it's particularly important because so much of our state's history is inextricably linked to this effort around suffrage. So efforts to secure the vote for women really began in the mid-1850s, the mid-19th century. And in late, probably around 1881, 1883, 1885, there were successive repetitive efforts to try to have the legislature give the right to vote to women. So it also speaks to, I think, a lot of the character and the grit and the importance of being very persistent in the realm of public policy. We take for granted that women won the right to vote, so it must have been easy, but in fact, it was incredibly arduous in Arizona. It was very contentious. And many of the elements that were involved, meaning the types of tactics, the strategy, you can see those themes today still throughout our electorate and in our politics and public policy. I hope we'll have a chance to get into that a little bit. But like with all anniversaries, it gives us a chance to look back, to appreciate, and then really to measure where we are. We've got lots of encouraging signs, but today I'm sure we'll explore many of the areas where we can still make improvements.
Thank you. Justice Timmer, some comments?
Yes, thank you. And I, as with my fellow panelists, I'm delighted to be here and to be part of the celebration, and thank you for asking me to do so. I completely agree with the reasons that were just cited by President Klein and by Dr. Brown regarding the importance of this event. I think an additional thing that occurs to me is that in addition to doing the right thing, because that just was the right thing for people to be able to have a say in how they're governed, to finally give women the right to have a voice, to be empowered to speak out. That certainly is obviously we're celebrating. Another thing, though, that is very interesting is at the time in the 19th century, they had these things called spheres. And so people spoke in terms of the women's sphere and the men's sphere. And the women took place in the home, and mostly the men were out there in politics, running the government, and out there in the working world. And a reason is because men were considered less fragile than women, physically and mentally superior. I think that when the 19th Amendment was passed, and before that, as you say, in Arizona, it started to shatter that spheres and those ideas that women have a particular place in our society. So that was really, and you look at what's happened since then in the past 100 years, how far women have gone, and there's no such talk about these types of spheres any longer. If we look at other countries that have kept their women disenfranchised, they are not as economically prosperous countries. They're not, fairness does not abound there. So truly it was a step for the United States and for Arizona to go down the path of truly enhancing society, and that's certainly we're celebrating.
So thank you all. You all gave me a lot of things to think about and some additional threads that I think we should pick up with in our discussion as we move forward. So one of the things that really struck me in President Klein's remarks was about the sort of difficulties in Arizona in trying to get the vote back in 1912 and some of the failed legislative attempts. So I was hoping you all could talk about what was happening in Arizona, why Arizona was ahead of the curve on this issue, because we do predate suffrage at the federal level by 8 years. And maybe because this was sparked by President Klein's remarks, we can start with you, President Klein.
Thanks. I agree. I think it's a really fascinating examination to understand why was Arizona ahead of its time, really. And I think one simple answer is that women had many more equal roles in Arizona, being a Western territory, a place that was just being settled. Sometimes we forget we're a very young state. So when we think back to our statehood, it really was a time when there were not a lot of people here, and women played very important roles. So that's not to say that there wasn't still considerable effort and lobbying around giving women the right to vote. But I think it really was born out of this spirit, this kind of can-do, must-do spirit in the American West. But as we really think about what it meant to pursue the vote and to get the vote and the coalition building, I think we should note, and we probably will want to talk a little bit about what it meant to give women the right to vote in Arizona, because in fact, not all women got the right to vote when our state became a state. You know, it took the next election at the ballot to be able to win over the public support. It famously, Frances Muns, one of the suffragettes at the time, decided to abandon her appeals to male legislative reason, and instead she went after the male popular vote. But in doing so, it left some people behind, particularly Native Americans, who, because of conflicts in federal law and state law, really never properly secured the right to vote until 1948. So it was many, many more years later. So I often think of it as being a time that it really opened the door. It has interestingly come to define Arizona very clearly. We're a state that's known to elect more women generally and more female governors. So those early fights and struggles now have clearly defined our state and our electorate.
Justice Timmer, why do you think Arizona was ahead of the national curve on this?
Well, it's difficult to add to what President Klein had just said, that I think that what Seneca Falls was in 1848, and the platform there that did not go over with the East, in the East, for allowing women to vote, really those still started that reverberation throughout the country, and states started picking it up. When I talked before about the women's sphere being weak and fragile, obviously, if you're out here in Arizona, you are not weak and fragile. There's no air conditioning. It's hot. You're working side by side with the men to really forge an existence out here. And I think, as President Klein said, that proof to all the men in the territory at the time that women were not weak. They worked just as hard as the men. They were just as smart, and they deserved a voice in politics. So many of these women, these early suffragettes, had positions of power and platforms from which to speak, and they used it. Josephine Hughes was with her husband, owned the Arizona Daily Star to get words out like that. You had Charlotte Hall, who was a renowned writer and write poems and such, which assisted. So there was more ability of the women out here to really shine, I think, out west. And that's why you have Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and then Arizona going for the vote, I think, before it really spread to the east. And one thing that I think is really, I don't know, it's just kind of a fun fact, I thought, that when Arizona did get the right to vote, that there was a parade to celebrate the accomplishment, and 10,000 people turned out. And you think, 10,000 people, did they even exist in Arizona? The answer is probably no, but the parade was down Fifth Avenue in New York City to celebrate Arizona getting the right to vote, because the women back there wanted to showcase it, wanted to celebrate it, because of course they wanted the right to vote. So I thought that was fairly interesting.
Very interesting factoid. Dr. Brown, is there more to add?
I think, one of the things that I think both President Klein and Justice Timmer are calling our attention to are the different kinds of timelines that are in place here. So we have we have Arizona existing as a territory. We have the entire conversation around the 1840s, the US-Mexican War, the move to establish and create and bring in new territory that will help to constitute the United States of America. But those movements in the mid-19th century are also very much linked to not just the expansion and the further development of potential states, but really thinking about what are some of the economic imperatives of the United States at that time. So we have, on the one hand, we have a whole creation of America happening in the East and in the South, in the North and the South, if you will. And then there's this Western access that in some ways is late to the conversation. It's later, we'll just say that, it's later to the conversation about what will constitute America. And because of that, because there is this 19th century as opposed to 18th century push, you now have the benefit of all of the colonial experiment and experience and success and trials, but you also have some real modern, if you will, 19th century imperatives as well. So what we see here is, in some ways, Arizona has a blueprint for what will work. It also has blueprints for how women are shaping public policy. I mean, one of the most famous American women writers of her time, Harriet Beecher Stowe, recognizes that actually the home and the hearth are the true cradle of democracy, right? Those are the places that all mothers are raising future citizens and by that she meant men, and sons and really is a sense of possibility for the United States, but we also, I think, see it navigating some really difficult realities, right? Because the access to the ballot, the access to conversations about suffrage really do differ depending on what your class is, what your gender is, what your religion is, and what your language is. And those are things that are still so very much with us today. But the conversation about why Arizona, it's certainly part of this emerging new landscape for America. And we also know that there are some political, sort of social motivations as well. I think one of the intriguing facts about why Wyoming became such a forerunner was it had everything to do with marriageability. There was a 6-to-1 ratio of men to women, and the men of the state decided that if they advanced women the right to vote, that more eligible bachelorettes would head to the territory. And hey presto, you know, in some ways that did indeed work. So the right to vote is always inextricably linked to some other agendas, some of them social, some of them distinctly political. But that's part of Arizona's sort of place in the West at a time when nation making is still very much underway.
So let's jump from the past to the present. We're all sitting here right now in our own homes. I have cleaned up my home very nicely for this, so you all don't see, you know, the stacks of junk that I have hidden off to the sides behind me. But right, we're all social distancing right now and doing this recording on Zoom because of this ongoing public health emergency. But we're also in the middle right now of an election cycle. And so there's some real concerns right now about what to do with voting and how to keep social distancing still happening while we're trying to conduct our elections. What do you all think about potential changes that might be made to the election process, and how those changes, if they are made, might affect women or other minorities, which has been brought up in some of our discussions by Dr. Brown and President Klein. What might that look like for women and minorities, and what could we do to ameliorate any negative effects that might happen? I think maybe this time I'll start with Justice Timmer. I don't think you've had a chance to go first.
Well, I think that's a really interesting question that you pose, and it's one, at least, that I don't think anybody has really studied in depth yet, and that could be the number one concern right there, is that because the virus is unfolding and the future, the immediate future, is so uncertain, that there's a fear of knee-jerk reactions and making quick changes without being able to really think it through of how will it affect certain segments of society, women and minorities in particular, and hopefully a consideration by people much wiser than I am, and in this field, they're giving this deep consideration. But from what I've read, it seems that some of the ideas that people are posing, different states should go to the no excuse absentee voting, which we have here in Arizona already, an extended time for voting. You could have moved to an extended early voting period, talking about moving polling places out of where they've traditionally been, like nursing homes for obvious reasons, so that people won't be exposed there. That kind of thing. Possibly online voting, although I don't think they can get to that quickly in many states this year. For people that keep in-person voting, obviously there's a concern, as happened with recent primaries, that poll workers won't show up, so that you're going to have longer lines, longer waits. And even if you can have that kind of safe distancing, many people, I'm thinking women in particular, might not have the ability to wait those long lines, particularly if they have children at home that they're caring for who are out of school because of this viral situation. So it could negatively impact them, women in that format. You could also have, whenever you have a change in polling places in a traditional setup that people are used to, you have the danger of a lack of communication. And how is communication going to be made for those kind of quick changes? The obvious answer would be the internet, but the problem with that is that not everybody has access to the internet. We're used to that everyone, of course you can pick up, you can go to the library and look on the computers. Well, can you? Now they're closed. So in terms of communication of where polling places will be, or even how to vote, if you're allowed to get some type of mail-in ballot, that could be problematic for people who are economically disadvantaged. And if minorities, particular minority groups, fall into that economic disadvantaged group, they could be peculiarly impacted and negatively impacted by that and not being able to vote. Also, the mail-in vote, you think, the mail-in voting, that's the way to go. And it does seem the way to go for health reasons, but in the states that currently have it, and I think many states do at this point, they've noted that it's really the high-income educated people who are using mail-in balloting, and not people, again, that are less education, less income, that, again, could be negatively impacting minorities there. People that move frequently, who are in homeless shelters, who might not have a permanent address. Those are issues when you have ballots catching up to those folks that could disenfranchise them. And one thing that I thought of that, I don't know if it's a realistic threat, but from maybe because I've been doing a lot of, looking at a lot of domestic violence stuff lately, if you have mail-in votes, perhaps some of the privacy of the voting booth is diminished if you're in a household with a dominant figure who might want to direct what your vote will be, rather than what the woman would actually, how the woman would actually want to vote. This is something that just occurred to me could be an issue. Finally, your question was, well, how can we do the thing? I think in the long run, what I hope is that the people in charge of this will think in terms of a combination of ways in which to vote. I hope that we don't eliminate in-person voting, because I truly believe that there are some people, and perhaps people of lower income and such, will be the ones that will always want to go to vote on the day. So perhaps expanding the days that you can go to a polling place safely, in combination with online, in combination with mail-in ballots, that kind of thing. That might be the way to go. But my bottom line is that people should be having those considerations as they deem which way to go to safely vote this year, and probably next, and hopefully no longer than that.
You gave us a lot to think about, that's for sure. Dr. Brown, would you like to add anything to this list of potential solutions and potential problems?
Well, that was just such a really expansive and deliberate answer. And I think one of the things that strikes me is from Judge Timmer's answer is that how much it highlights the reality of voting, that voting is not something that happens in isolation. It is linked to one's social, personal, everyday life and experience. It's impacted by how you work, when you work, if you work, where you live, where you are, just where you attend school, how you are navigating your access to information. So there is so much that I think is being revealed now, not only about the vulnerability of the democratic process, about the vulnerability in some senses for civic engagement, but also the ways in which we have to take care of each other as members of this body politic. So in some ways, I'm hoping that one of the silver linings that comes out of this awful pandemic is that we actually see each other so much more clearly, and that we are moved to take even more responsibility for how each of us progress and maintain our health, whether that's social health or political health. In some ways, as somebody who's teaching students in the 21st century, but who loves to live in the 18th and 19th century in the archives, and I'm always trying to navigate those distances, one of the things that helps to make sense of the chaos of today is to remind students in particular that we have already been here. Right? The world has already navigated significant global pandemics. It has navigated and confronted economic depression that has stopped everything as, life as so many people knew it. So in some ways, we are not in a new place. It's new for us, but as a world, we have been here before. So the sort of another dimension is, what have we not yet attended to, even prior to the pandemic? So when we think about access to the ballot and the ballot box, or to the mailbox to deposit the ballot, over 75%, I read the statistic that over 75% of Arizonans vote by mail, but less than 20% of individuals residing on Native American reservations in Arizona outside of Maricopa and Pima counties, less than 20%, 18% actually managed to vote by mail, partly because of access to postal stations. It's, so when you begin to think about the deserts whether it's a food desert or a voting desert. There are so many ways in which we have not yet fully attended as a state to ensure that everyone has access, or that we're factoring in the complications, both in terms of tribal nations, both in terms of economic stability or education and access, to the general conversations about what it means to vote. So at this point, there is no doubt that there is going to be impact on who votes. There's also going to be a real impact on how the candidates themselves interact. We know that the president depends on, is fueled by in-person rallies. That has completely changed for him in terms of his access to his base and to those who are enthusiastic. We know that conventions, political conventions, those cannot happen in the ways in which they've been imagined. So again, we're going to have to rethink how we see each other as voters, how we begin to fuel our own energy and excitement about what's at stake, and how do we actually try to not feel as though we are all single individuals casting one vote, but that we're all part of a larger national conversation. And I think we really have an opportunity and a mandate now to go forth and think about more inclusive and attentive and rigorously attentive ways to bring as many eligible voters into conversation and into the act of voting than ever before.
President Klein, what do you think about the ongoing health emergency and what might happen with voting? I think you're muted right now.
Certainly, we are right to be concerned about participation, and I think more is better. Just very simply, more options are better. And it's all of this change is coming at a point in time when women really have embraced this responsibility and this right to vote. So over 60%, about 60% of women voted in the 2018 cycle. Close to 70% of women are registered to vote in Arizona. So it's a very large group who's very interested, making sure that they are able to get to that ballot box one way or another is absolutely critical so that the women's voice can be heard.
Well, I think that leads me into my next question, right? This discussion about women's voice. Sometimes you hear about blocks of voters who vote in particular ways, have favorite candidates or have particular issues that they're interested in. And so, of course, there's a belief that there's sort of a block of women, or at least maybe blocks of women subdivided further by race or education or some other factors like that. Do you think that there are sort of women's issues, women's votes that are out there, and that women vote differently from men? I think I'll start with you, President Klein, since your answer to that is what prompted me to want to talk about blocks of women voters.
You bet. Well, certainly any candidate who's not paying attention to women as a voting bloc is going to be missing the boat, and no more so than in Arizona. So it is a smart play to be concerned about women. It's not just in voting, by the way. Women are making 70% of the consumer decisions in this country, so we shouldn't be surprised that voting is going to be any different. I think there are some issues that more naturally are of interest to women, in part because women have historically needed to attend to those. So when you go back to the beginning in Arizona, when women were able to get the vote and women were able to hold office, finally were able to get themselves elected to office, even though it took decades before our statutes were changed so that the word male was removed as a requirement for being a legislator. But the women who held office early on began to pursue things like wage increases for women, and childcare and schooling naturally became issues they were concerned about and that they'd been highly motivated for. It's not to say that that's all that women care about or that men don't care about those things, but there certainly is a legacy there. I think for most women, they really want to know that, like all individuals, that anything that matters to them is going to be considered, that they have full participation to weigh in on all the issues. And it's really important that women not be, while we want them to be paid attention to and to be recognized as important decision makers, that they not be pandered to. So it's concerning always when someone decides that being a woman is the most important qualification a person can hold. Most people probably just want the best person to be in that office. Often it is a woman, but I don't think we should presume that women are only going to vote for women or only going to vote on women's issues. I would add just one more thing, that in fact, many issues that are often combined and kind of rolled up into this notion of being women's issues, including issues like abortion, are some of our most divisive issues. They create some of our largest partisan divides. So I think we need to be careful more and more that we can't just assume that women are monolithic as a group and unilateral thinkers.
Justice Timmer, what do you think about blocks of women voters and what women's issues might be?
Well, I completely agree with President Klein in her remarks, particularly the last remark, that you can't count on, even if there's a particular issue that women are more naturally interested in, like right to life, that kind of thing, that we're going to take a uniform position on it, because that's simply not the case. I'm always hesitant to talk about women's issues or men issues or those kinds of things, because it goes against my grain, candidly, that it seems like all issues should be women's issues. All issues that affect our society should be men's issues as well. So with that said, though, that there are some things that women, I think, naturally want to speak up on a little more, particularly if they don't feel like others are bringing attention to it, such as trafficking, for example, of other women. Those were issues that I had heard being brought up by women organizations way before it started to become more politically popular to talk about it in those terms, and before the light was kind of shown on those issues. That was something that women groups back in the late 90s were trying to bring attention to, saying, look, this is what's going on. So I think that women are sensitive to reach out to those types of issues when they see injustice being done, particularly to other women, and want to try to bring the issue forward and hopefully be embraced by everyone, as trafficking has been. Similar issues would be equal pay for women, education issues, those types of things. And President Klein is absolutely right that a politician is doomed for not succeeding, for absolute failure, if they don't recognize the power that women have these days in voicing their opinions.
Dr. Brown?
Well, so I would say that one of the things that's really striking here is the way in which women have been able to mobilize across social media platforms, across a whole number of platforms in a number of spheres, and really take their place at the forefront of decision-making and political progress and advancement. I mean, the very company on the call represents the advances that we have made in our state, in our nation. What's also really important, I think, is if we think back to the ways in which women's issues, whether it was temperance in the 19th century, for instance, that was absolutely critical to, and was critical to the larger mobilization around the right to vote, but that the temperance movement itself represented all sorts of divisiveness. And so as we're thinking about women's issues, it seems really critical to ask who is not being represented in this seemingly monolithic women's issue. So for the very examples that Justice Timmer noted and that President Klein had referred to, thinking about, yes, are we talking about missing and Indigenous women, right? Are we thinking about the ways in which pay equity doesn't translate into minimum wage advances for unskilled labor? Are we thinking about populations who are not necessarily, quote, the face of a particular movement? But there is no doubt that women have been advancing the political football around particular issues. And to see the number of women in Congress today, to see those women wearing white at really just powerful moments of representation, underscores the power of mobilization and women's candidacy. I think the infrastructure about advancing women's voices has also been critical. That's something that that we have to recognize, that these things don't just happen, that there has to be networking and collaboration. But there's also then, because of those things, going to be some real moments of compromise and some moments of really depressing separation as well. So one of the lessons that we get from the 19th and early 20th centuries really is rooted in the ways in which African American women kept seeing the suffrage movement as something that was determined to proceed, even if it meant separating them and sidelining them. And so you have really well-known figures like Ida B. Wells and Frances Harper and Marianne Shadd Carey and others who are traveling across the United States, also going to Europe, to challenge people like Frances Willard and Susan B. Anthony at various moments, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, on the ways in which they are presenting a women's movement that is not inclusive, but that is so vital, even as it depends on others being set aside in order to gather and garner, some support from other quarters. So women's issues are inherently political. I think for us as a 21st century audience, it's imperative that we keep asking which women are not yet part of this conversation. Not necessarily who's not here, but who else could be part of this? How else is this issue being made manifest in communities, whether it's through the lens of race, religion, or ethnicity?
Well, let's dig into some of those comments a little bit more. I mean, you raised the issue of African Americans and their struggle to get the vote, and then, obviously women are, trying to get the vote, and how those work together or in opposition. So maybe I'll kick it back to you to sort of dig more deeply into what role race and immigration and national origin, what that might play in women's suffrage movement, either in Arizona or more broadly nationally.
So one of the things that's really critical for us to remember is that we have this anniversary. We have these anniversaries. We have the Arizona anniversary and we have the national anniversary. But those were not a golden ticket, if you were. 1924 was the passage of the Indian Citizenship Act. And we know that the negotiations around tribal sovereignty, about the presence of Native American communities and nations. We know that language, in terms of the languages that are represented on ballots and how initiatives are passed, that all of those are wrangled in. And it's not until 1924 that Native Americans are granted citizenship. We know that Asian Americans do not receive the right, Asian American women do not receive the right to vote until the 1950s. We know that we have a Voting Rights Act that's passed in 1965. Precisely, it's a blueprint, or it's like the photographic negative of all the things that have been difficult. So that while we have this national proclamation that all women now have the right to vote, what we do have are facts about the ways in which at the state level, at the city level, at the local levels, we have disenfranchisement actively being enacted. Everything from physical and sexual intimidation of women who rally others and escort them to the polls, bizarre literacy tests where people are given a blank piece of paper to, quote, read, and of course they can't, so they fail the test and therefore are not able to vote. All the ways in which the slippery slope of inclusion really is not, it's not a happy narrative to include alongside the larger celebration of this, of the passage of the 19th Amendment. So for us, really, as engaged participants in this discussion, just across the board as engaged citizens and people in America, it's really important to keep asking, how have the challenges been made bare? What has been difficult? Because we know that there's resistance, right? There was resistance to women taking leadership positions. We've just come through a cycle where we're looking for the first woman president, and we've, sort of 2 campaigns worth of approaching that. So we know that there are glass ceilings that still exist, but we also know that there are glass walls in place as well. And so history bears that out. And for us, it's really important to link issues of today to the issues and examples of yesterday, to then monitor and assess what progress we have in fact made and what mandates we still have to enact.
President Klein, would you like to comment on the role of race and maybe immigration in the women's suffrage movement?
Well, certainly it is, again, part of the story then around winning suffrage and becoming a state. And all of those same issues are still prevalent in politics today. Those issues play out time and again. They're in a different form, in a different fashion, but there's hardly a year when the legislature isn't debating some form of those issues, whether, it's how people can vote, who can vote, what are the requirements for voting. We've seen the same types of discussions around immigration. Certainly, Arizona is no stranger for close to 20 years now of being the forefront of Americans' modern immigration debates. But some of those same themes, some of those very same groups of people who were residents and citizens and immigrants were also in the mix as part of the discussion about building the coalition to determine whether women could vote. So it's important to realize that yes, much has changed. When you really contemplate that 150 years ago, we probably wouldn't be having this kind of conversation. The right to even be educated would have been unavailable, unattainable for many of us. Certainly the right to own property, to have any kind of a sense of the future or a place without a husband. Those things seem so foreign to us, but yet really aren't that distant. There's still a lot of what much of the debate is about today. So I think for young women in particular, those numbers I spoke of earlier with the number of women voting, we've seen an uptick in young women in particular who are voting, which is very exciting. It's important that they stay also attuned to what's happening in the state legislature and in Congress, because some form of those same stories and incidents are playing out even today.
Justice Timmer, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I think it's important to, as much as when we celebrate an anniversary like this, and I'm thinking Arizona is, I guess, 108th, that the women who really pushed for this, the suffragettes, and who achieved their goal, were not perfect. And I don't think that we can celebrate them, frankly, without realizing that they also were not inclusive. And as Professor Brown points out, did not include minorities who lived in Arizona at the time, minority women, and in fact, even used as part of their strategy playing on the prejudices of others and trying to achieve the vote. There was at one point in the territorial days where the women coupled with, I think it was the mine owners or business owners who wanted to have some type of literacy test. Well, the reason why was because they wanted men of Mexican American heritage not to be able to vote, who were less educated, because they knew that they were not in favor of women voting. So they wanted to eliminate the voice of those people in order to maximize their chances of getting the vote. They didn't actually succeed in that try, but that's the kinds of things that people were doing. And I think it's important to look back and realize that when we hold people up who came before us and anyone who did good works, that you realize that that's only part of the story, that there were other things that shouldn't be admired by today's standards, and that, or even by standards then, and that we should not forget that. And as we repeat things and repeat the tenacity that they exhibited, that we do it at a higher level that's more inclusive and don't repeat those mistakes.
Well, part of what the suffragists, of course, were doing was trying to appeal to people to want to give women the right to vote. And to do that, some of their tactics included appealing to these sort of moral considerations, things like temperance, there shouldn't be drinking of alcohol or gambling or sexual exploitation of women. And there was this thought, at least maybe, that appealing to some of those sorts of considerations might help shed Arizona's kind of Wild West image. Do you think that those were effective morals, image-based arguments? Does that good outweigh some of the bad that maybe you were talking about? I'll kick it back to you, since really I'm just picking up on your comments.
No, I think they lost the men when they said we want to cut back on the alcohol, the gambling, and the prostitution. I think that was it. That was it. So, the early ones, people like Josephine Hughes, really, their goal was to have prohibition and cut down on the prostitution and have more health care, those types of things. And then it was at some point they realized the only way we're going to get this, because the men aren't going to go for that, is to get the right to vote ourselves. So it was, I think, as Professor Brown mentioned, there was other things afoot, that they wanted to achieve their goal of their temperance goals primarily, and to do that they needed to get the vote. So that is that really didn't work for them, and eventually evolved into people around the time of statehood who really pushed forward, the Francis Muns and the Charlotte Halls. They took up the same kind of temperance type drive, but it kind of veered into, well, they wanted more equal rights. Now we're talking equal rights, where that's appealed more to more people, that it's only fair and to have equal rights. So that was a better message. I think it's interesting in Arizona that at the time that the women were pushing for the right to vote, the state was pushing the right to be a territory, the right to be a state. So those two things were going hand in hand. So at the time that Arizona wanted to become a state, the folks back east did not have a positive image of Arizona. So even our senator from Indiana, who was the head of the Territories Committee, and I pulled this quote out, said that the great American desert was inhabited by culturally incompatible Spanish-speaking residents and dominated by a few large absentee-controlled mining corporations and the big railroads. So they were really concerned about Arizona becoming a state, thinking that they wouldn't be dominated by big business. And next door, of course, New Mexico, they considered had too many Hispanic folks in that wasn't Anglo enough for New Mexico. That's why for a while they wanted to put them together and to make one big state. So the suffragettes at the time, seizing on that opportunity, was doing just as she said, Professor Birch. They started to pitch the right to vote as showing that Arizona is a little bit more refined, and that they're more progressive state, and they're going to give the women the right to vote. And this would demonstrate to the folks back east and to the president that would occur, that they would enhance their chances for statehood if you could give women the right to vote, and they can make some of these cultural changes. So, I'll just give you, I like quotes. So a quote from something that was written to Governor Hunt then from Josephine Hughes was, "For more than 30 years, Mr. Hunt, a large portion of the most womanly women in Arizona have been working and hoping for the time when they could use their influence in assisting the molding and directing the affairs of our municipalities and territory. Nothing can be done at this time which would give a stronger impetus to the statehood movement than that of enfranchising the intelligent womanhood of Arizona." And according to Professor Osler from ASU, who I pulled this out of her book, she says womanly women and intelligent womanhood, that's code for Anglo women. But that's what they were trying to use to sell that. It didn't go over because the men thought that would actually hurt their chances of statehood, but that's how it unfolded.
Dr. Brown, would you like to comment on some of these moral-based tactics that the suffragists were using?
Oh, I think Justice Timmer has really just laid out so much for us that really captured both the politics and what was at stake, and some of the motivations and those really illuminating reflections from the time. So I think that really sums it up. The connection between statehood and suffrage is profound. I think it has everything to do with, again, this idea of nation making that is happening in the 20th century in a way that is going to position the United States even more deliberately in terms of its power, its international standing, but then also the ways in which we are imagining this body politic and the land of the free. I think there's also, again, just to reiterate, I think the conversations about temperance, about the moral, sort of the moral high ground, if you will, that always comes, sort of the inverse is, if someone is moral, who is immoral, right? So it's, again, a moment for these binary oppositions that are not especially helpful, but actually do represent the ways in which our political system has evolved. We have, are you for or are you against? Are you this party or that party? So the polarization piece here is something that I think really informs the social message. But Justice Timmer really just laid out so beautifully all of the high stakes, I think, for the suffragettes who are going forward, and the coded language and the coded expectations that were in play at the time, and that perhaps still persist.
President Klein, would you like to add anything?
No, I think everybody covered that so well, and it's an area that I think every student, not just of the law, but anyone who lives in Arizona should take time to look at, reflect on, and then think about going forward.
Well, speaking of going forward, are there any changes that we should be making to our democratic processes here in Arizona that would be informed by what we've been talking about our experiences with women's suffrage in the past? Maybe I'll start with you, President Klein.
Sure. I would say that we need to really continue to advocate that people participate. And even though it's said a lot, it really can't be said enough, because many of the issues that the suffragettes immediately began to tackle once they were able to get into office are things that we're still facing. So just winning the right to vote certainly didn't make for easy sledding for anybody in the 20th century. And it's the same today. So while today your success, for instance, isn't necessarily determined by whether you have a husband, we still have a lot of overhang in our tax code and in other places in the law that can present challenges for women to really fully participate. We're fortunate Arizona has emerged as one of the freest states in the country. I think there are opportunities here that are available to people that may not be available to them in other states, remarkably. And that's one of the things that this egalitarian spirit that makes Arizona so attractive. But the truth is we have a lot of women leading households with children who are receiving federal assistance because they're still not able to make the way of life that serves them best and serves their families best. So I think those types of issues and encouraging women that even though that might seem like another thing to take on that they're not able to take on, that they must take on, because many of the circumstances today, not just how you participate in the electoral process, but really what's available to you for your children to go to school or the healthcare benefits you'll receive. All of that emanates somewhere from a policy or a law. So it's incredibly important that women be involved. It's only gotten more complex, the relationship between a woman's life day to day and what's happening with government and government policy. And so I think that it simply comes down to making sure that we go beyond even the 70% of women who are registered to vote, continue to drive, and then continue to drive turnout, and then continue to drive participation as issues are being debated, because every single one of those is impacting women, and sometimes disproportionately so.
Dr. Brown, are there any changes that you can see that we could make to our democratic processes?
Well, I think President Klein has really laid out what's at stake, I think, for so many, and what responsibilities our elected officials and those who aspire to public office really need to bring to their work and to their platforms. I think, again, it's the very conversation that we're having here, the attempt to think very deliberately and carefully and responsibly about the complications that are part of achieving an anniversary, of actually enacting legislation that invites women to vote and secures the right for them. But the fact that we're having this conversation, I think it underscores how important it is for everyone across the state of Arizona to understand the histories, and I use the plural there, the histories that inform our current motivations, our current efforts to ensure that everyone can vote have to be informed, or can be even more animated when we understand the context out and the histories out of which suffrage has happened. When young women, in the Navajo Nation understand how they were not part of the initial rush to the ballot box, when the word suffragette didn't conjure up images of women that looked like them, then they will understand, yes, this is indeed not an easy democratic process. It's not something that anyone should take for granted. And so when we understand that language matters, and that is a very contentious and historic conversation in the Southwest and across the nation. But when we understand that the ways in which one reads a ballot, the way in which one receives information about one's voting options, that those are also rooted in how we have become the United States, how we have become the territory, and how we finally became the state. So information truly is power. Knowledge is power. And it's not as time consuming as some might think. When it comes to actually acquiring knowledge. So in this day and age, we are learning more about the paths that led to really momentous and necessary. I think that's the other piece, is that it wasn't simply a gift, right? That here's a 19th Amendment to allow you to vote. That wasn't part of it. That it's not a gift. We know that people have worked across time to ensure that this right is actually enacted. It shouldn't be a privilege, and it isn't a gift. It's not a favor. It's something that comes with one's civic engagement. And so understanding that really does empower people and informs them. And so hopefully our democratic processes are going to really represent the commitment to sharing knowledge across the board.
Justice Timmer, would you like to say anything about this topic?
After those elegant remarks by my colleagues, I wouldn't dare. They said.
Well, I was thinking the same thing. I thought it was such a powerful ending there. Speaking of a powerful sort of person, we have Frances Willard Muns. She was the first female state senator. And she and some of her collaborators were once called, speaking of quotes, here's a good quote for you, Justice Timmer, unscrupulous short-haired women who posed as political bosses. These sorts of tactics were used by, we'll say, the elites to try to keep women from running for office. And clearly tactics like that didn't work, as Ms. Munn showed us. But what forces are in play today that might keep women from achieving some of these powerful roles in society? And I think as we discuss this, maybe we need to recognize, as I believe we already have, but But let me bring it to the forefront again that Arizona's experiences might be different in this regard. I mean, look at this very accomplished panel that we have here, including, President Klein, who's been a public servant, judges, justices. So we do have different experiences maybe in Arizona, but are there some forces today that are stopping women from, let's say, becoming president, which is something that has also been raised? Dr. Brown, can I go ahead and start with you?
Sure. Well, one of the things that's really intimidating, I think, for many people when they begin to imagine themselves as public servants is what happens when you step into the public sphere. So we know, for instance, that vetting of candidates is one thing that's very rigorous, but we also know that at this particular time, no stone will be unturned, right? So that one's political life is a very public life. We also know that many of our elected officials are hearing from many more constituents, and they're also hearing from many more people who are invested either in their success or in their failure. So part of one sobering reality is really the intimidation that can happen. The access to people, more than, we hear way too many times that people are receiving death threats because they are thinking about support of one bill or another. We think about the leverage around financial support for candidates and platforms. There's so many factors that go into being an engaged and committed and dedicated public servant. And so that's also something I think that conversations like this are pulling the curtain back on that, but it also underscores the value of networks, right? So when we think about organizations that are committed to the successful advance of women, thinking about political office from everything at the city and town level all the way to the White House, and we think that they are ensconced in movements that are dedicated to their success, but also to their acquisition of knowledge about how to navigate those systems. So I think that yes, there's the real impact of public life, if you will, but part of the thing that is offsetting that is the fact that so many women are now not doing that work towards public service alone. They're doing it in the company of like-minded organizations that are committed to their success. So that's one thing I think that should give us hope, even though we can see so many other machines perhaps at work to set them aside or to derail their candidacies.
Justice Timmer?
Yeah, this is an issue I've given some thought to. Why you're not seeing more women in these positions. I was struck by our recent Red for Ed. Was it last year that the teachers went out on strike, and my building is right in the plaza there, so you could see them. It was quite a sight. All these people in red just pouring down the street, and whether you were for or against any of their positions, it was really quite something to see. And it struck me that most of the teachers were women, yet all the leadership were men. And I'm like, why was that? And so that's just an example of things. We see that kind of thing all the time. Why isn't it rising up? And my thought on is that even culturally, women are adverse usually to risk taking. They don't like to look dumb. They don't like to fail at things so publicly unless they really feel like they're prepared in the position. Whereas men seem to be a little bit more, willing to go out on that limb. And I don't know why that is. If it stems from childhood, that could be a whole other interesting discussion. But part of that too is that women still aren't great on self-promotion. And it's difficult because you still hear your mother's voice, perhaps, I do, saying, it's not nice to brag. You can do your best and people will acknowledge your accomplishments. Well, that's not true. You have to be comfortable with and get out there and self-promote. So I think some of that might play into people willing to take the risks for running for office and going up the chain in politics, if you will. Also, there's still some notions of women's roles. and what role that they have. I remember when I was applying for the Court of Appeals, the court I was on before this one, a negative on me remark made by someone on the commission was that, well, she's good and she's got all this resume, but she's awfully ambitious. And some remark about who's home raising her children. So there was kind of a dig on me as a mother, and you know, in a way that a man probably wouldn't get, but those kinds of forces are still out there. And when I got the job, I'll never forget my first week. I had not one but two of my new colleagues come to my office to tell me I only got the position because I was a woman and I better prove myself. So ways that I don't think that men kind of get that kind of thing going on. So there's all those kind of negative forces that are still out there that women have to overcome in a way that men don't, which is fine. You know, you just have to push your way through it. But I think the way to do it is exactly what Professor Brown said, that it's just critical that you have a strong network of people, men or women, around people that are qualified and that should be assuming these positions, that encourage people to go for it and to try to attain them. Because we need everybody. We need every good person.
So President Klein, clearly you have been in the public service. So can you tell us about some of the forces that tend to push in the opposite direction, that tend to hold women back?
Well, they exist. They're real. I can tell you that. I've also had the privilege of serving as a chief of staff to a female governor, and I was struck and shocked at the time to have heard comments from male political figures that were along the lines of, that poor lady, she's in over her head. And whether you agreed or didn't agree with any of her positions, or whether you had an affinity for her as a leader or not, the truth is it completely undermined 30 years of practical experience and hard work on her part. And it was striking because it's not something that you would typically think about in conversations about male leaders. Now, to Professor Brown's point, let's face it, that vetting process isn't just rigorous, it's vicious. So it's not to say that anyone in the public arena doesn't face some sort of criticism or some sort of attack, but there were many occasions that I was reminded that I spent a lot of time thinking about image, calibrating, messaging and voice to make sure that it was drawing more people in rather than turning people off. That's a cultural issue. That's something for us to think about as a culture. I would say the parallels, though, are also there in business. I think the new frontier now for women is thinking about women to be on corporate boards. It is taking the support of men. Corporate boards today are predominantly male. So even though we're seeing more female college students, more female college graduates, more female leaders in the business world, we're finding that women still aren't populating the very top offices. And there's some great study and literature going on about that. But the truth is we do need, as Justice Timmer said, the support of everyone to recognize qualified good people to take on these roles. And importantly, it's happening very early. So in business, it makes a big difference to make sure that you take that emerging, promising female leader and you move her into that first level of responsibility so that she can continue to grow as a leader. So as we see women taking on more leadership roles in the workforce, we shouldn't be surprised that then they are also going to be able to afford themselves the opportunity to run for office. It's definitely a group endeavor in that regard. It does, you have, not only do you have to have thick skin, but you do have to have a group of people who will help you get there and help you succeed. So I think that there is much more work to be done there before we begin to see a true equalization of not just opportunity, but really fulfillment of opportunity.
Well, I really learned a lot from all of you today on this panel, and I want to just thank you for all of your thoughtful responses and insights and interesting quotes and factoids. I think maybe it might be a nice way to sort of conclude this panel somewhat the way we began, just by getting some of your closing thoughts on today's Law Day theme, that is your vote, your voice, our democracy. And President Klein, since you went last on the last question, you may go first on this one.
Well, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to be here today. I appreciate everyone who's tuning in for Law Day. I certainly am delighted to have this chance and this opportunity to have this conversation. I myself learned a lot. I hope that this has been beneficial. And importantly, I hope that we will really take this anniversary as a moment to think about who we are as a state, who we are as individual citizens, what we can do to contribute to thoughtful and civil public dialogue, and how we can really dedicate ourselves to making sure that opportunity is available for every single person in this state. I think there is much to be learned from the experience of the suffragettes. We still have much to overcome in terms of making sure equality is really there so people can pursue their own happiness, their own liberty, and their own agency. But I would say that moments like this really give us that chance to make sure that we're just running down the checklist, making sure that we are doing all that we can and thinking about how we can more fully engage ourselves.
Dr. Brown, some concluding thoughts?
Well, I'll echo what President Klein has said. It's just been such a pleasure to be part of this really important and illuminating conversation. I'm honored to be in company with each of our panelists and our esteemed moderator. And this is a moment for reflection. I think, as Justice Timmer said earlier, thinking about this anniversary, thinking about this commemoration is also an invitation to think about the complexities of it. It's to understand that there are lots of stories, lots of perspectives, and lots of details that we have yet to actually bring into the larger, more general conversation. So the theme of your vote, your voice, your vote, your voice, our democracy, I think I would, as the humanist, as the English professor in the room, I would say, let's make all of those plural. So it's our votes and your votes, because we want to encourage this sense of repeated action and the sense of commitment to longevity in terms of the process. And that once we're all working towards a continuum. And so thinking about the ways in which democracy depends not just on one action, but on multiple actions. And that it also depends on generations worth of work. We have a history of women, some of whom laid down their lives, some of whom faced incredible odds, hardship, and terrifying moments, but who were not swayed. They saw something worth fighting for, and in some cases worth dying for. And for us to take up the mantle of their leadership, to recognize that voting is essential to transformation. It's also essential to one's sense of purpose and possibility. All of those things are critical, I think, as we imagine ourselves at this moment of 100 years and thinking about what will the next 100 years bring. What are the granddaughters and the great-granddaughters ahead? What are they going to do in order to secure the rights of all women to be able to vote well, freely, and in ways that reflect their interests and their aspirations? But there is a lot to be hopeful for, especially if we each bring to our conversations about voting, about this anniversary, we bring questions. What do we not yet know? What do I want to know more about? Whose name do I not yet know? And what might I learn about her and her contributions to the democracy in which we exist today?
Justice Timmer?
Well, I too, I join my colleagues in thanking you for this opportunity, part of this terrific panel today. I've learned a lot and I've really enjoyed it. The only bad thing is I didn't get an opportunity to be there in person to talk with all of you, but maybe we'll do it another time. I too think that this is an important conversation in terms of your theme about your vote, your voice, and our democracy, and I like the plurals for it. We have so many issues in society today. As there will always be issues in society. They will always be complex. the only way to meet them is to have all of our voices heard. So what's important today is not only our voices being heard by all parts of our society, be it via vote or opinion or however it's expressed, but also that we're very cognizant that we have an obligation to try to shape the voices of tomorrow to an extent by ensuring that the people under our care, our children, will have that voice and be well informed to make considerate opinions and to take these positions on. So those future voices are also something that we should be cognizant of. However, we should also remember that our voices are informed by the voices of people long dead who shaped our society, and in the context of our panel today, achieved the right to vote for us in Arizona. So because I do have that love of quotes, I wanted to leave with one quote that I found from Frances Muns, who was a grandmother at the time, our first woman state senator in 1915, and second in the nation, by the way. And during her campaign, she said this, quote, I want the women to realize that they will have to make a concerted demand for the things they want and not merely present a bill and ask someone to put it through for them. I want them to get into the battle themselves, end quote. And I think if I had anything to say to any women out there, it's just that. You need to get into the battle yourselves and use your voice that way. Thanks.
Amazing discussion. Thank you to all. I was enthralled and I'm excited to get to share this on Law Day. Thank you, Professor Birch and President Klein, Justice Timmer, and Dr. Brown. That was excellent.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. It was fun.